Story 5 of The Crimson Gardenia and Other Tales of Adventure by Rex Beach. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 5, Man Proposes, The Story of a Man Who Wanted to Die, Part 1. There were 17 policies in all, and they aggregated an even $1 million. It thrilled Butler Murray to note his own name neatly typed upon the outside of each. Those papers possessed a remarkable fascination for him, not only because they meant the settlement of his debt to Muriel, but because his life, instead of being the wholly useless thing he had come to regard it, was really, by virtue of these documents, a valuable asset upon which he could realize at once. $1 million was a great deal of money, even to Butler Murray, and yet it was so easy. Why, it was even easier to make that amount than it had been to spend it. Although the former process might not prove so amusing, it at least offered a degree of interest wholly lacking in the latter. When DeVoe entered, Murray greeted him warmly. "I'm glad I caught you, Henry. They told me you've been out West somewhere." "Yes, I'm promoting, you know. Mines." DeVoe flung off his fur coat and settled into an easy chair. "Getting along all right?" "No. My friends either know too little about mines or too much about me. I've a good proposition, though, and if I could ever get started I'd clean up $1 million." "Oh, it's not so hard to make $1 million." "How the deuce do you know? You've never had to try. By the way, why are you living here at the club? Where is Mrs. Murray?" "She is at the farm with the children. We have separated." "No! Jove! I'm sorry. What does it mean? The road to Reno?" "I hardly think she will divorce me on account of the publicity, although she ought to." "Woman scrape, I suppose?" "Oh, nothing like that. I've spent all her money." DeVoe opened his eyes in amazement. "Oh, see here, now. You couldn't spend it all. Why, she had even more than you." "It's all gone. Hers and mine." "Good Lord!" "Yes, I was always extravagant, but I've been speculating lately. I thought I'd get a sensation either way the market went, but I was disappointed. I dare say I have exhausted my capabilities for excitement. It's a long story, and I won't bore you with it, but to be exact, all I have left is the town house and the farm and the place in Virginia. There isn't enough income, however, to keep any one of them going." "Well, well, you have been stepping along. Why, it's inconceivable." DeVoe stirred uneasily in his chair. The calm indifference of this broad-shouldered, immaculate fellow amazed him. He could not tell whether it was genuine or assumed, and in either event he was sorry he had come, for he did not like to hear tales of misfortune. Butler Murray, the millionaire, was a good man to know, but— "I sent for you because I need—" "See here, Butler," the younger man broke in abruptly, "you know I can't lend. I'm borrowing myself. In fact, I was going to make a touch on you." "Oh, I don't want your money. I want your help. I think perhaps I'm entitled to it, eh?" Henry flushed a trifle. "You're welcome to that at all times, of course, and if I had a bankroll I'd split it with you, but I just can't seem to get started." "Suppose you had $25,000 cash. Would that help?" "Help? Good heavens, I could swing this deal. It would put me on my feet." "I'm ready to pay you that amount for a few weeks of your time." "Take a year of it, 2 years, take my life's blood. 25,000! You needn't tell me any more. Just name the job and I'll take my chances of being caught. But, I say, you just told me you were broke." "I received about $50,000 from the sale of the yacht, and I invested the money. I want you to help me realize on that investment." Murray tossed the packet of papers he had been examining into DeVoe's lap. After scrutinizing them an instant, the latter looked up with a crooked, startled stare. "Are you joking? Why, these are your insurance policies." "Exactly. There are 17 of them, and they foot up $1 million, the limit in every company. They begin to expire in March, and I don't intend to renew them. In fact, I couldn't if I wanted to." The two men regarded each other silently for a moment, and then the younger paled. "Are you crazy?" he gasped. "The doctors don't think so, and that is the heaviest life insurance carried by any man in America, with a few exceptions. Do you think they would have passed me if I'd been wrong up here?" He tapped his forehead. "I intend that you shall receive $25,000 of that money. The rest will go to Muriel." DeVoe continued to stare alternately at the policies and his friend, then cleared his throat nervously. "Let's talk plainly." "By all means. You will need to know the truth, but you are the only one outside of myself who will. For some time I have felt the certainty that I am going to die." "Nonsense. You are an ox." "The more I've thought about it, the more certain I've become, until now there isn't the slightest doubt in my mind. I took my last dollar and bought that insurance. Do you understand? I'm considered rich, therefore they allowed me to take out $1 million. God Almighty, man!" DeVoe's sagging jaw snapped shut with a click. "Let me finish. Then you can decide whether I'm sane or crazy, and whether you want that $25,000 enough to help me. To begin with, I'll grant you that I'm young, only 40, healthy and strong. But I'm broke, Henry. I don't believe you realize what that means to a chap who has had two fortunes handed to him and has squandered both. I'm really twice 40 years of age, perhaps 3 times, for I have lived faster than most men. I have been everywhere. I have seen everything. I have done everything, except manual labor, and of course I don't know how to do that. I have had every sensation. I'm sated and old, and sometimes I'm a bit tired. I have no enthusiasm left, and I'm bankrupt. To make matters worse, I have a wife who knows the truth and 2 lovely children who do not. Those kids believe I'm a hero and the greatest man in all the universe. In their eyes I'm a sort of demigod, but in a few years they'll learn that I have been a waster and thrown away not only my own fortune, but the $1 million that belonged to them. That will be tough for all of us. Muriel knows how deeply I've wronged her, but she is too much a thoroughbred to make it public. Nevertheless, she detests me, and I detest myself. She may decide to divorce me. At any rate, I have wrecked whatever home life I used to have, for I'll never be able to support her, even if I sell the 3 places. I'll be known as a failure. I'll be ridiculed by the world. On the other hand, if I should die before next March, she would be rich again." Murray's eyes rested upon the package of policies. "Perhaps time would soften her memory of me. The youngsters would have what they're entitled to, and they would always think of me as a grand old handsome parent who was taken off in his prime." He smiled whimsically at this. "That is worth something to a fellow, isn't it? I don't want them to be disillusioned, Henry. I don't want to endure their pity and toleration. I don't want to be in their way and hear them say, 'Hush, here comes poor old father.' Do you understand?" "To a certain extent." "Then you really intend to kill yourself?" DeVoe glanced about the cozy room as if to assure himself that he was not dreaming. "Decidedly not. That insurance wouldn't be payable if it was suicide. I intend to die from natural causes before the 1st of March." "What do you want me to do?" "Very little. Keep me company, answer questions about my illness, perhaps. Attend to a few things after I'm gone. You might even have to prove that I didn't take my own life. Do you agree?" "Whew! That's a cold-blooded proposition. Are you really in earnest?" "It took nearly my last dollar to buy that insurance. I will execute a promissory note to you for $25,000, payable 1 year from date. Borrowed money, understand? The executors will see that it is paid. Is that satisfactory?" "But you say you can't kill yourself, and yet—" "Good Lord! How calmly we're discussing this thing. What makes you think you'll die of natural causes within the next 3 months?" "Well, I shall see that I do. Oh, I've thought it all out. I've studied poisons, but there is the danger of discovery when one uses them. They'll do to fall back upon if necessary, but there is a better way, which is quite as certain, reasonably quick, and utterly above suspicion." "What is it?" questioned DeVoe, interestedly. "Pneumonia. I had a touch of it once, and I know. They nearly lost me. It takes us big, robust fellows off with particular ease and expedition. You and I will take a hunting trip. It is winter. I will suffer some unexpected exposure. You'll do what you can to save me, but medical attention will come too late. It won't take 2 weeks altogether." "If you're looking for pneumonia, I know the place. When I left 10 days ago, men were dying like flies. You won't need to go hunting it. It will come hunting you." "Out west somewhere?" "The Nevada desert. That's where I'm mining." "Deserts are usually hot." DeVoe shivered. "Not this one, at this season. It's a hell of a country, Butler. 5,000 feet elevation, biting winds, blizzards, and all that. You just can't keep warm. But the danger is in the Poganip." "The what?" "The Poganip. What they call the breath of death out there. It's a sort of frozen fog peculiar to that locality." "Then you accept my offer?" Again DeVoe hesitated. "Are you really going to do it?" "Well, then, yes. If I don't take your money, I suppose you'll employ somebody else?" "Good. We'll leave tomorrow." "Can you get your affairs in shape by then?" "I don't want them in shape. Don't you understand?" "Oh, I see." After a moment the younger man continued, "It's all very well for us to plan this way, but I'm not sure we'll succeed in our enterprise." "Why not, pray?" "Well, I dare say I'm a good deal of a rotter. I must be to go into a thing like this. But I have a superstitious streak in me. Possibly it's reverence. At any rate, I believe there is a power outside of ourselves which appoints the hour of our coming and the hour of our going. I'm not so sure you can pull this off until that power says so." Murray laughed. "Nonsense. What is to prevent my shooting myself at this moment if I want to?" "Nothing, if you want to. But you don't want to. Why don't you want to? Because that power hasn't named this as your time. I don't make myself very clear." "I think I see what you're driving at, but you're wrong. We are masters of our own destinies. We make our lives as full or as empty as we choose. I have emptied mine of all it contained, and I don't consider that I am doing any one an injury in disposing of what belongs alone to me. Now, we'll complete the details." The speaker drew a blank note from his desk and filled it in. It was with a very natural feeling of interest that Butler Murray watched the desert unfold before his car window a few days later as his train made its way southward from the main line and into the badlands of the Nevada gold fields. There was snow everywhere. Not enough for warmth, but enough to chill the landscape with a gray, forbidding aspect. It lay, loose-piled and shifting, behind naked rocks, or streamed over the knife-edge ridges, swirling and settling in the gullies like filmy winding-sheets. All the world up here was barren, burned out, and cold, like his own life. It was a fitting place in which to end an existence which had proven such a mockery and failure. Goldfield was a conglomerate city in the hectic stage of its growth. Rough, uncouth, primitive, it lay cradled in the lap of inhospitable hills, upon the denuded slopes of which derricks towered like gallows. The whole naked country spoke of death and desolation. A bitter wind, laden with driving particles of sleet, met the travelers as they stepped off the train. DeVoe's headquarters consisted of a typical mining camp shack in the heart of the town, containing a bare little office and 2 sleeping rooms, the hindermost of which gave egress to a yard banked in snow and flanked by other frame buildings. Murray selected the coldest apartment and unpacked his belongings, the most precious of which was a folding morocco case containing 3 photographs, one of Muriel and one each of the boy and the girl. Then followed a week of careful preparation. Together the 2 men made frequent excursions to various mining properties. Murray mingled with the heterogeneous crowd of brokers, promoters, gamblers, and mine owners. He took options on claims and made elaborate plans to develop them. He was interviewed by reporters from the local papers. Articles were printed telling of his proposed activities. When he had laid a secure foundation, he announced to Devoe that the time had come. It appeared that the latter had by no means exaggerated the dangers of this climate, for men were really dying in such numbers as to create almost a panic, the hospitals were overcrowded, and Murray had been repeatedly warned to take the strictest care of himself if he wished to preserve his health. The altitude, combined with the cold and wet, and the lack of accommodation, was to blame, it seemed, and accounted for the high mortality rate. Doctors assured him that once a man was stricken with pneumonia in this climate, there was little chance of saving him. That evening he let the fire die out of the stove in his room, then went next door to a little Turkish bath establishment, and proceeded to sweat for an hour. Instead of drying himself off, he flung a greatcoat over his streaming shoulders, slipped into boots and trousers, then stepped across the snow-packed yard to his own quarters, where he found Devoe bundled up to the chin and waiting. His brief passage across the open snow had chilled him, for the wind was cruel, but he blew out the light in his chamber, flung off his overcoat, then, standing in the open door, drank the frost-burdened air into his overheated lungs. "God, you're half naked," chattered the onlooker. "You'll freeze." The moisture upon Murray's body dried slowly. He began to shake in every muscle, but he continued his long, deep breaths that congealed his lungs. He became cramped and stiff. He suffered terribly. He felt constricting bands about his chest. Darting, numbing pains ran through him. He could not tell how long he continued thus, but eventually the sheer agony of it drove him back. He closed the door and crept into bed, the clammy cotton sheets of which were warm against his flesh. Through rattling teeth he bade good night to his friend, saying, "Don't mind anything I do or say during the night." Devoe lost no time in seeking his own warm room, where Murray heard him stamping and threshing his arms to revive his circulation. There could be but one outcome to such a suicidal action, the frozen man reflected. Stronger fellows than he were dying daily from half such exposure. Why, already he could feel his lungs congesting. Although the agony was almost unendurable, he forced himself to lie still, then traced the course of his blood as it gradually crept up through his veins. Eventually he fell asleep, tortured but satisfied. Henry found him slumbering peacefully late the next morning, and when he arose he felt better and stronger than he had for years. "Jove, I'm hungry," he said as he dressed himself. "I expected to find you mighty sick," his friend exclaimed wonderingly. "I slept cold all night." "It seems I didn't catch it that time. I must be stronger than I thought." He ate a hearty breakfast, and although he tramped the hills all day in the snow and cold, watching himself carefully for signs of approaching illness, he was disappointed to discover none whatever. At bedtime he repeated his performance of the night before, but with the same result. When he awoke on the second morning, however, he found the desert town wrapped in the dark folds of a fog that chilled his marrow and clung to his clothing in little beads. It was a strange phenomenon, for the air was bitterly cold, and yet saturated with moisture. Mountain and valley were hidden in an impalpable dust that was neither fog nor snow, but a freezing, uncomfortable combination of both. Devoe hugged the fire all day, saying to his guest, "You'll have to do the trick alone, butler. It's too deucedly unpleasant sitting there in the cold every night. I'll get sick." "It's not very agreeable for me, either, and the least you can do is to keep me company. That's the agreement, you know." After some argument, Devoe acceded, saying, "Oh, if you want me to hold your hand while you freeze, I suppose I'll have to do it, although I can't see the use of it." That night, when Murray had regained his cheerless room after taking his Turkish bath, he drank a goblet of raw whiskey, then flung wide the door, and, standing upon the sill, half nude and gleaming with perspiration, inhaled the deadly poganap. When the fiery liquor had driven the last drop of his hot blood to the surface, he seized a bottle of alcohol and, upending it, drenched his body. If he had suffered previously, he now endured supreme agony. As the alcohol evaporated upon his naked skin, it fairly froze the blood he had forced up from his heart's cavities. He groaned with the pain of it. Again he felt as if his body were coating with ice. His lungs contracted with that agonizing grip. "This is too cold for me," DeVoe chattered finally. "I'm going to beat it." As Butler Murray cowered and shook in his bed an hour later, he decided that his third and final effort had succeeded, for not only did he plainly feel the effects of that terrible ordeal, but by every law of nature and hygiene he was doomed. He had drunk the whiskey to increase the peripheral circulation of his body to the highest point, then by the use of the alcohol had reduced his temperature to a frightful extent and driven his blood back, frozen and sluggish. That was inevitably suicidal, as the least knowledge of medicine would show. It could not be otherwise. He was very glad, too, for this suffering was more than he had bargained for. He awoke in the morning feeling none the worse for his action. He did not even have a cold. DeVoe's amazement at this miracle was mingled with annoyance, which he showed by complaining. "See here, Butler, are you kidding? You might at least have a little consideration for my feelings. This suspense is awful." "My dear fellow, I'm doing all I can." Murray filled his chest, then pressed it gingerly with his palm. There was not a trace of soreness. His muscles lacked even a twinge of rheumatism. That day he had another window cut in the wall of his room, immediately over his bed, and after exposing himself as usual upon retiring, left it open and slept in the draught. Finding that this had no effect, he undertook to sleep without covers, but the bitter weather would not permit, so he purchased drugs, and after returning from his Turkish bath, swallowed a sleeping potion. When he could no longer keep his eyes open, he lay down, nude and dripping, where the frigid wind sucked over him. Sometime, somehow, before morning, he must have covered himself, for he awoke between the sheets as usual. With the exception of a thick feeling in his head, however, which quickly wore off, he possessed no ill effects. Day after day, night after night, he exposed himself with a deliberate, methodical recklessness that seemed fatal. Time after time his good constitution threw off the assault. DeVoe declared querulously that his friend looked even better than when they had arrived, and the scales showed he had put on 5 pounds of weight. The affair assumed an ironical, grisly sort of humor, which amused Murray, but it was maddening to DeVoe. One howling, stormy afternoon the former bundled his accessory into warm clothes and took him for a long walk. Leaving the town behind them, they plowed up through the snow to the summit of a nearby mountain, where the gale raged past in all its violence. Henry was cursing the cold and grumbling at his idiocy in coming along, and when he had regained his breath, growled, "Understand, Butler, this ends it for me. I never agreed to kill myself. Hereafter you can make your Alpine trips alone. I've had a cold now for a week." Murray laughed good-naturedly. "Remember, if I fail, I can't pay you." "For heaven's sake, then, get it over with. I need that money, and I have nerves." The former speaker opened his coat, and DeVoe saw that he had left the house with no protection whatever beneath it except trousers and footwear. His body was wet from the climb, but he exposed it openly to the storm until he was blue with cold, while the younger man stamped about, threshing his arms and lamenting his own discomfort. That night Murray repeated his Turkish bath, swallowed his usual narcotic, and lay down upon his draughty couch, to be awakened sometime after midnight by a cry of "Fire!" He noted dully that a vivid glare was flickering through his open windows, and saw that the roofs adjoining were silhouetted against a redly glowing sky. He heard a great clamor of shouting voices, gunshots, bells, running feet, so arose and dressed himself. Instead of donning his regular clothing, however, he drew on a pair of trousers, thrust his bare feet into rubber boots, then buttoned a rubber coat over his naked shoulders. When he undertook to rouse DeVoe, Henry refused to get up, murmuring sourly beneath his blankets, "It's too cold, and I've just fallen asleep. Been tossing around for hours." "Very well. If it should spread in this direction, I'll come back and help get the things out." The blizzard of the previous day had increased in violence, and as Murray stepped out into it, the cold sank through his thin garb and cut him to the bone. His raincoat was almost no protection, the rubber boots upon his bare feet froze quickly, but he smiled with a grim, distorted sense of satisfaction as he decided that here perhaps was his long-awaited opportunity. A winter fire in a desert mining camp is a serious calamity. Water is scarce at all times, and at this particular season Goldfield was even drier than usual. Volunteers had already joined the insufficient fire department, but the blaze was gaining headway in spite of all. The wind played devilish pranks, serving not only to fan the conflagration, but to deaden human hands and reduce human bodies to helpless, clumsy things. Butler Murray plunged into the fight with an abandon that won admiration even in this chaos. He had no fear, he courted danger, he led where others shrank from following. In and out of the flames he went, now blistered by the heat, now numbed by the wintry gale. His body became drenched with sweat, only to be caked in ice from the spray a moment later. Icicles clung to his brows, his boots filled with water. It was he who laid the dynamite, it was he who set it off and raised the buildings in the path of the conflagration, checking the swift march of destruction. Although he labored like a giant, taking insane risks at every opportunity, his life seemed charmed, and dawn found him uninjured, although staggering from weakness. Women brought him hot coffee and sandwiches. Then, when the fire was under control, he returned to his quarters, half naked, as he had set out. It had been one long battle against the blind god Luck, and he had emerged unscathed. And yet he had not lost, for no human body could withstand a strain like this. His previous exposures had been as nothing compared with what he had undergone these many hours. If this did not bring pneumonia, nothing could. As he lurched up the frozen street, men cheered him, and something warm awoke in his heart. But when he stumbled into DeVoe's room, he found that young man still in bed, his cheeks flushed and feverish. Henry was coughing and groaning. He complained of pains in his head and chest. An hour later a doctor pronounced it pneumonia, and when the patient grew rapidly worse he was moved to the wretched excuse for a hospital. Murray snatched a few hours' sleep that night as he sat by his friend's bedside, and the next day found him as fit as ever. But in spite of every attention, DeVoe's fever mounted, his lungs began to fill, and on the second night he died. The suddenness of this tragedy stunned Butler Murray, and its mockery enraged him. He had promised DeVoe, toward the last, to take his body East, and now decided it was just as well to do so, for he had proven, to his own satisfaction at least, that he could not catch pneumonia, no matter how hard he tried. A few hours later, therefore, he was on the overland train bound for New York. He had wasted a month of valuable time, but as to relinquishing his purpose, the idea never occurred to him. End of Story 5, Part 1. Story 5 of The Crimson Gardenia and Other Tales of Adventure by Rex Beach. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 5, Man Proposes, the story of a man who wanted to die, Part 2. The physical comfort of his club was most agreeable after his recent ordeal, but he enjoyed it only a few days, then began to look about for a suitable place in which to end his grim comedy. He selected the spot with little delay, a sharp turn in a hillside road that wound down from the heights near Spuyten Duyvil. He had often passed it in summer and knew the danger well. If his automobile went over the edge, now that the roads were icy, who could say it was not accidental? He did not advise Muriel of his return, fearing to trust himself either to write or to telephone, but spent much time in front of the morocco case with its 3 photographs, longing desperately to see her and the children. When he felt that an auspicious time had arrived, he phoned his friend, Dr. Herkimer, and invited himself to dinner. Herkimer was delighted, and a few evenings later the clubman motored out toward Yonkers, where he was made welcome and spent an agreeable evening. "Where's your chauffeur?" the doctor inquired, as his guest drew on his fur coat and driving gloves, preparatory to leaving. "I let him go to-night. I thought I'd enjoy running the machine for a change." "The roads are bad. Be careful you don't skid on the hills. I nearly went over to-day." Murray promised to heed the warning, and a few moments later was gliding toward the city. The beauty of this cold, sharp night was inspiriting. The moon was brilliant, the air was charged with life and vigor. It gave him a thrill to realize that he was sweeping to probable death, that nothing now could intervene to thwart him, and while, of course, there was the unpleasant possibility that a plunge over the declivity might do no more than maim him, he had studied the place carefully and intended to reduce that chance to a minimum by driving his car down the hill with sufficient velocity to hurl it far out over the edge. There were railroad tracks beneath. Anything short of instant death would be miraculous. As he came out upon the heights, at last it occurred to him that he was behaving very well for a man about to die. His hands were steady, his heart was not greatly quickened, and he was absolutely sane and healthy and full of the desire to live. A short distance from the crest he stopped his machine, then sat motionless for a few moments, drinking in the beauty of the night and taking his farewell of Muriel. When he had arrived at peace with himself, he fixed his wife's image in his mind, then, thrusting down the accelerator, let in the clutch. There was a jar, a jerk, a spasmodic shudder of the machinery. The motor went dead. This unexpected interruption affected Murray oddly until he realized that after stopping the car he had neglected to shift his gears to neutral. With an imprecation at his stupidity, he clambered out and cranked the motor. When it failed to start, he primed his carburetor and cranked again. It was an expensive foreign-built machine, and one turn should have served to set it going, but strangely enough there was no explosion. For 15 minutes he did everything his limited knowledge permitted, but the car remained stationary upon the crest of the hill, a stubborn, lifeless mass of metal. Evidently that jerk had wrought havoc with some delicate adjustment, he reasoned, perhaps the wiring, but it was too dark to diagnose just where the trouble lay. It was cold also, and his numb fingers refused to be of much assistance. He gave over his efforts finally, and stared about with a troubled look in his eyes. This was childish, utterly idiotic. He wanted to laugh, but instead he cursed, then cranked the motor viciously until the sweat stood out upon his forehead. An hour later he was towed into town behind a rescue car summoned by telephone from the nearest garage. As he left his machine to board a subway train, the mechanic announced, "Maybe it was a good thing you broke down before you hit that hill, boss. There was a bad accident at the turn to-day. The police are trying to close the street till spring." Murray was not superstitious, but recalling his many failures at Goldfield, he decided he would make no further attempt to do away with himself by means of his motor car. Now that this particular road was closed to traffic, he knew of no other place so favorable to his project, and inasmuch as the time was growing short, to be only partially successful in his attempt would mean utter ruin. With no little regret, therefore, he made up his mind to fall back upon poison, which at least was certain, even though possessed of obvious drawbacks. His experience with DeVoe had rendered him a bit cynical regarding the value of friendship, hence it was with no fear of a checkmate that he telephoned to Dr. Herkimer and made an appointment for that afternoon. When the doctor arrived at the club, Murray laid the matter before him in a concise, cold-blooded manner, and was relieved to hear him voice exactly the words DeVoe had used. "What do you want me to do?" "I want you to call here for me to-morrow morning. You will find me dead in my bed. I want you to examine me and call it heart failure or whatever you think best. Your word will be sufficient. There will be no suspicion, no further examination, at least until the poison I intend to use will have had time to disappear or change its form." "And why should I do this?" The doctor looked his friend over oddly. "Here is one reason which I hope is sufficient." Murray held out a promissory note for the same amount as the one he had executed for DeVoe. Herkimer took it. Then, as he read the figures, his face paled. Crushing it in his palm, he rose and, in a voice harsh with fury, unloosed a stream of profanity that surprised his hearer. "You contemptible, short-bred loafer," he concluded. "What do you take me for? What makes you think I'd do such a rotten thing as that?" Murray smiled. "You'll have to, old man. It isn't pleasant, of course, but you won't allow Muriel and the children to lose that money. I like your spirit, but I shall kill myself just the same, and it's up to you to see that they are not ruined." Again Herkimer became incoherent. "Oh, swear as much as you please. I'm going to do it, nevertheless. I've made a wretched failure of everything else, but I intend to right one of my wrongs while there is time." "Right? Wrong?" bellowed the physician. "Damn it, man, you're asking me to help you steal $1 million. Does that occur to you?" "The end justifies the means in this case. You're not rich. That 25,000—" Herkimer flung the paper at the speaker. "Well, if you won't take my money, you'll have to help me out of friendship. At 9 o'clock to-morrow morning I shall be dead. Knowing the truth and all it means, you'll have to come. You can't stay away." "Oh, is that so?" the doctor mocked furiously. "I'll show you whether I can or not." He jerked his watch from his pocket and consulted it. "There's a train for Boston in 20 minutes, and I'm going to take it. I couldn't get back here in time even if I wanted to. Now, kill yourself and be damned to you." He seized his hat and rushed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. A moment later Murray heard a taxicab whir noisily away from the clubhouse door. Manifestly there were more difficulties in the way of this enterprise than he had counted upon. Without the cooperation of some reliable physician, the clubman dared not do away with himself in New York. Coroners are curious, medical attention is too prompt, he was too well known. The very existence of that tremendous amount of life insurance would lead to investigation. He decided to go hunting, and he knew just the right place to go, too, he thought. Several years before he had joined a gunning club which owned a vast expanse of rice fields and marshlands in North Carolina, and knowing the place thoroughly, he concluded that it offered perfect facilities for such an action as he contemplated. Accordingly, he packed his guns, wired for a guide, and boarded a train for the South that very night. In his pocket he carried a vial containing 25 grains of powdered cocaine. The club launch met him at Boonville, the nearest station, and during the 20-mile trip down the Sound he learned all he wished to know. The shooting was well nigh over, there were no other members at the clubhouse, he could have the place all to himself. For several days he hunted diligently, taking pains to write numerous letters to his friends, and among others to Muriel. It was his first letter since their parting, and the strain of holding his pen within formal bounds was almost too much for him. It was a pity she would never understand his motives in doing this thing, he reflected. It was a pity he had never understood his own feeling before it was too late. Manlike, he had thrown away the only precious thing of his life while searching for counterfeit joys, and manlike, he regretted his folly now that he had lost her. That evening he informed his guide that he intended to hunt by himself on the following morning, and, in answer to the old negro's warning, assured him that he knew the channels well and was amply able to handle a canoe. He rose early, forced himself to eat a substantial breakfast for the sake of appearances, then set out in his Peterborough. The morning was chilly, and he had purposely donned a heavy sweater, shell vest, leather coat, and hip boots. He paddled down the river for a mile or more, then let his craft drift with the current. Far away on one horizon was a dark, low-lying fringe of pines marking the mainland. 2 miles to seaward sounded the slow rumble of the restless Atlantic. On every hand were acres upon acres, miles upon miles, of waving marsh grass interlaced with creeks and channels. Nowhere was there a sign of human life. He took the little bottle from his pocket, reached over the side, and filled it with water. He replaced the cork and shook the vial until the white powder it contained was thoroughly dissolved. There were 25 grains of it, 8 fatal doses, and he had seen that it was fresh. This time there could be no question of failure, he reasoned, nor was there much chance of discovery, for after that drug had remained in his body for a few hours it would be exceedingly difficult of identification, even at the hands of an expert toxicologist. But there were no experts in this country, no doctors at all, in fact, this side of Boonville, 20 miles away. He marveled at his coolness as he flung the cork into the stream and raised the bottle to his lips. His pulse was even, his mind was untroubled. He drank the contents, filled the bottle, and let it sink, then rose to his feet, and, bearing his weight upon the gunwale of his canoe, swamped it. Burdened as he was with shells and hunting gear, he sank, but the cold water sent him fighting and gasping to the surface again. The blind instinct of self-preservation mastered him, and, being a powerful swimmer, he struck out. He had planned too well, however. His boots filled, his clothing became wet, and he went down for a second time. Then commenced a senseless, terrible struggle, the more terrible because the man fought against his own determination. He rose slowly to the surface, but the shore was far away. The canoe, bottom up, was out of reach. He gasped wildly for breath as his face emerged, but instead of air he inhaled water into his lungs. He choked, horrible convulsions seized him, his limbs threshed, his arms roared, his chest was bursting. He rose and sank, enduring the agony of suffocation, all the time fighting with a strong man's desperation. After a time he seemed to hear shouting. Something tugged and hauled at him. He discovered he could breathe again. His senses wavered, left him, returned. He saw faces bending above him. A moment later he heard his name spoken, then found himself awash in the bottom of a gamekeeper's bateau. As in a dream he heard his rescuers explain that they had been out in search of poachers and had rounded the bend below in time to behold him struggling for his life. They were hurrying him back to the clubhouse now as fast as arms and oars could propel them, and after he had gained sufficient strength he sat up. He strove to answer their excited questions, but could not speak. A strange paralysis numbed his vocal cords. He could not swallow. His tongue was thick and unmanageable. This silence alarmed the wardens, but Murray knew it to be nothing more than a local anesthesia due to the contact of the cocaine. He became conscious of feeling very wretched. They helped him up to the clubhouse, and on the way he caught glimpses of horrified black faces. He saw the superintendent preparing to send to Boonville for a doctor, but knowing that the launch had already left, calculated the time it would take for a canoe to make the trip, and was vaguely amused to realize that all this excitement was useless. He experienced a feeling of triumph in the knowledge that he had succeeded in spite of all. A short time later he was in bed, packed in warm blankets and hot water bags, but through it all he maintained that distressing numbness. Despite the artificial heat, his hands and feet tingled as if asleep, then became entirely numb, and he reasoned that the cocaine had begun to affect his circulation. He noted how the chill crept upward slowly, showing that the drug was working. On the mantel opposite he saw Muriel smiling at him from the morocco case, and realized that she was very beautiful. After a time her outlines became less distinct, which told him that his optic nerve was becoming affected. Next, the contents of the room grew hazy. That was quite as it should be. He was much interested to note his heart action, which by now had become very erratic. Every pulsation that ran through him sounded as plainly in his ears as a drum beat. He noticed that they were regular for a time, then gradually increased in speed until his heart raced like a runaway motor, then ceased suddenly, began again slowly, faintly, grew slower and fainter, until with every flutter he thought, "This is the end." When this phenomenon had been repeated time after time, the sick man endeavored to assist the poison's effect. At each feeble recovery of his heart, he held his breath and strained with all his might, striving by every force of will to stop the systolic action. As he had often heard that men live again their evil deeds in the hour of dissolution, and while he had perhaps more than the average number of sins upon his soul, he determined to die thinking only of pleasant things, if possible. He recalled his wedding day and pictured Muriel as she had appeared that morning. How sweet and gentle she had been! What a wonderful time it had proved for him! They had sailed for the Mediterranean on the following morning, landing at Naples, where they had spent a week. From there they had gone to Rome for 3 dreamlike months, and then to Nice and to Cairo, all the time in a lover's paradise. From Egypt they had turned back to Morocco. Yes, Morocco, and how she had loved it there. Thence they had journeyed—where? To Spain, of course. Murray realized that his mind was working more slowly, which meant that the circulation to his brain was becoming sluggish. In a few moments he would be unable to think at all. It would be over. Muriel would be rich again. She was still young. She might marry some good man. From Spain they had gone by rail to Paris? No, the Riviera. It was very difficult to think. In Germany, he remembered, they had taken an old castle for the... From Germany they had gone... Yes, Muriel was gone. Murray awoke to find a trained nurse at his bedside. He was still in his room at the club, and after a time reasoned that the cocaine must be working very slowly. At the first words the nurse laid a hand upon his lips, saying, "Don't speak, please. You have been very ill." Stepping to the door, she called someone, whereupon a man came quickly. Murray recognized him instantly as the famous Dr. Stormfield. They had met here 3 years previous and shot from the same blind. "Hello, Murray," the doctor began. "I'm glad you came around finally. You've given us the devil of a fight." "How long have I been ill?" whispered the sick man. 2 days. Unconscious all the time. Lucky for you that I ran down for a little shooting, and happened to be on the launch from Boonville the morning you upset. We picked up your messenger on his way to town, and I got here just in time. Now don't talk. You're not out of danger by any means." That evening the physician explained further. "You must have suffered a terrible shock in that cold water. I never saw a case quite like it. Your heart puzzled me. It behaved in the most extraordinary manner." "You say I'm not out of danger?" "Far from it. Your heart is nearly done for, and the slightest exertion might set you off. If you got up, if you raised yourself off the bed, you might go out like that." Stormfield snapped his fingers. "I suppose my wife has been notified?" "Yes." The doctor looked at his patient curiously. "Would you like to have her come?" "No, no." A frightened look leaped into Murray's eyes. "That's not necessary, you know." After a time he said, "Leave me, please. I'm tired." When the doctor had closed the door, he lifted himself to his elbow, swung his feet out upon the floor, and stood up. Then, faint as he was, he began to stoop and raise himself, flexing his arms meanwhile, as if performing a calisthenic exercise. He was possessed by the one idea that he must succeed while there was still time. The nurse found him face downward upon his bed and sounded a quick alarm. All that night Stormfield sat beside him, his eyes grave, his brow furrowed anxiously. At intervals a woman came to the door, then, at a sign from the watcher, disappeared noiselessly. Thereafter Murray was never left alone. A day or two later he complained of this over-attention, saying that the nurse's constant presence annoyed him, but Stormfield paid no attention. After a time the physician startled him by inquiring abruptly, "See here, Murray, what did you take?" "I don't understand." "Yes, you do." "Why, what makes you think I took anything? Come, I'm a specialist. I have some intelligence." There was a pause, then the sick man finally admitted, "I took 25 grains of cocaine." 25 grains? God, it's incredible. 8 grains is the largest dose on record. You're dreaming, or else the drug was stale. I was particular to see that it was fresh. Stormfield paced the room, shaking his head and muttering, "I wouldn't dare report such a thing. I'd be called a faker. And yet there are no hard and fast laws of medicine." He stopped and stared at his patient. "What the devil prompted you to do it, with such a wife?" "That's just it," the latter cried miserably. "Oh, you've done for her a great injury by saving me, Doctor. But I won't allow it. I won't." "I see." The doctor went to the door, where he summoned someone to enter. A woman rose from her chair in the hall and came swiftly to the bedside. Her face showed the signs of a long and sleepless vigil, but her eyes were aflame with a hunger that held Butler Murray spellbound and amazed. "You!" he said weakly. "When did you come?" "I have been here for days," she answered. "Did you think I could stay away?" "Oh, my Muriel!" He held up his shaking arms, whereupon she knelt and took his tired head to her breast. "I thought I was doing right," he confided, after he had told her everything, "but I see now that I was all wrong." "God will name the day," she declared simply, "and until he does, no man can say, 'I will.'" "Are you quite sure you have acted wisely in showing me my folly? Remember, we are poor. Even yet I might make you rich again, for there is time, and I'm not worth this great sacrifice." "Sacrifice? This is the day of our triumph, dear. When we had all those other riches we never knew contentment, love, or happiness. Now we can start again, with nothing but ourselves and our children. We don't have time to be unhappy. Are you willing to try with me?" He stroked her soft hair lovingly and smiled up into her eyes. "DeVoe was right. There is a power. I shall pray God every day to spare me, sweetheart, for now I want to live." End of Story 5, Part 2. Story 6 of The Crimson Gardenia and Other Tales of Adventure by Rex Beach. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Story 6, Told in the Storm. The front room of the roadhouse was deserted, save for the slumbering bartender, back tilted in a corner, his chin upon his chest, and one other man who sat in the glare of a swing lamp playing solitaire. It was perhaps 3 hours after midnight. The last carouser had turned in. There was no sound save the scream of the black night and the cry of the salt wind. At intervals only, when the storm lulled, there came from the back room the sound of many men asleep. I stumbled out from the rear room, heavy-eyed, half-clad, and of a vicious temper, dressing in sour silence beside the stove. "Did they wake you up?" the card-player inquired. Yes." "Me, too. I'd rather bunk in with a herd of walrus in the mating season." He was a long, slim man with blue-black hair and a gas-bleached face of startling pallor, from which glittered 2 wild and roving eyes that flitted in and out of my visual line toward, to, and past me with a baffling, elusive glimmer like that of jet spangles. His hands were slender and bony and colorless, but while he talked they worked, each independently. They performed queer wizard antics with the cards, one-handed cuts, rapid, fluttering shuffles, and frame-ups, after each pass leaving the pile of pasteboards as square-edged and even as before. While he observed me over his shoulder, one hand wandered to some scattered poker chips, which clicked together beneath his touch into a solid ivory column as if separately magnetized. He shuffled and dealt, and cut the discs, and made them do odd capers, like the cards. "I slept in a menagerie tent once," said he, "but these people have got it on the animals." He nodded toward the sleeping quarters. "The open life seems to make a Pan's pipe out of the human nose," said I, with disgust. My indignation was intense and underlaid with a sullen fury at losing my rest. I seized the stranger and led him with me to the open door, saying roughly, "Listen to that." The room was large and low, dim lighted and walled with tiers of canvas-bottomed standees 3 high. The door was a litter of boots, the benches piled with garments. Every bed was full, and the place groaned with sounds of strangulation, asphyxiation, and other disagreeable demises. The bunks were peopled by tortured bodies, which seemed to cry of throttlings, garrotings, and sundry hideous punishments. My nervous system, unable to stand it, had risen a quiver, then shrieked for mercy. From the nearest sleeper came the most unhappy sounds. He snored at free and easy intervals, with the voice of a whistling buoy in a groundswell, a handsome resonant intake that died away reluctantly, then changed to a loathsome gurgle, as if he blew his breath through a tube into a pot of thick liquid. Now and then he smacked his lips and ground his teeth until the goose flesh arose on my neck. "That's the fellow that drove me out," said my new acquaintance, as we went back to our seats beside the stove. "I had the berth below him. I sleep light anyhow, since I woke up one night down on the Texas Panhandle and found a Chinaman astraddle of my brisket with a butcher knife." "That must have been nice," said I at random. "What did you do?" "I doubled up my legs and kicked him into the campfire." The stranger was dealing the cards again, this time into a fan-like, intricate solitaire, much affected by gamblers. "I tried the trick again to-night, but I went wrong. I tried to stop the swan song of the guy over my head, so I lifted up my feet and put them where the canvas sagged lowest. Then I stretched my legs like a Jap juggler, but I fetched away my own bunk and came down on the man below. I broke a snore short off in him. He'll never get it out unless he has it pulled. That was us you heard 2 hours ago." I was too tired and sleepy to talk, for I had come down from the hills the previous afternoon to find the equinoctial raging, and as a result the roadhouse full from the floor to ridgepole with the motley crew that had sifted out from the interior. The coastwise craft were hugging the lee of the sandy islet, waiting for the blow to abate. Telephone wires were down, and Bering's waters had piled in from the south until they flooded the endless sloughs and tide flats behind Solomon City, destroyed the ferries, and cut us off both east and west, by land and by sea. It were better, I had thought, to wait on the coast for a day or so, watching for a chance to dodge to Nome, than to return to the mines, so I had lugged my war bag into Anderson's place and made formal demand for shelter. The proprietor had apologized as he assigned me a bunk. "It's the best I've got," said he. "I've got you alongside of the stove, so if the boys snore too loud you can heave coal at 'em. Them big lumps is better than your boots." I had tried both fuel and foot gear fruitlessly, and when my outraged ears would not permit further slumber, I had given up the attempt. Now, while the blue-haired man with insomnia dealt idiot's delight, I sat vaguely fascinated by the play of his hands, half dozing under the drone of his voice. The wind rioted without, whipping the sea spray across the sand dunes until it rattled upon our walls like shot. Meanwhile my companion adventured aimlessly, his strange and vagrant fancies calling for no answer, his odd and morbid journeyings matching well with the whimpering night. His stories were without beginning, and they lacked any end. They commenced without reason, led through unfrequented paths, then closed for no cause. Through them ran no thread of relevancy. They were neither cogent nor cohesive. Their incidents took shape and tumbled forth irrelated and inconsequent. Wherefore I knew them for the truth, and found myself ere long wide-eyed and still, my brain as keen as ever nature made it. The story of the dead Frenchman has seemed strained and gruesome to me since, but that night the storm made it real, and the stranger's unsmiling earnestness robbed it of offence. His words told me a tale of which he had no thought, and painted pictures quite apart from those he had in mind. His very frame of mind, his pagan superstition, his frank, irreverent philosophy, disclosed queer glimpses of this land where morals are of the fourth dimension, where life is a gamble and death a joke. Whether he really believed all he said, or whether he made sport of me, I do not know. It may be that the elfin voices of the storm roused in him an impulse to gratify his distorted sense of humor at my expense, or at his own. He began somewhat as follows: "It's a good night for a dead man to walk." Then, seeing the flicker in my eyes, he ran on: "You don't think they can do it, eh? Well, I didn't believe it neither, and I'm not sure I believe it now, but I've seen queer things, and I've only got one pair to draw to. Either they happened as I saw 'em, or I'm crazy." He leaped at his story boldly. "I'm pretty tired and hungry when I hit Council City late one fall, for I'd upset my rowboat, lost my outfit, and mushed it 150 miles. My whole digestive paraphernalia is in a state of innocuous desuetude, if you know what that is, because all I saved from the wreck is a flour sack full of cigarette papers and a package of chocolate pills about the size of a match head. Each one of these pellets is warranted to contain sufficient nourishment to last the Germany army for 1 month. I read it on the label. They may have had it in them. I don't know. I swallowed one every morning and then filled up on reindeer moss till I felt like the leaping pad in a circus. Now, when I reach camp, I find there ain't any fresh grub to speak of. But I can't get away, so I stick on until spring. See, in time we begin to have scurvy, something terrible. 1 man out of every 5 cashes in. I'm living in a cabin with a lot of Frenchmen, and we bury 7 from this one shack. 7, that's all. It gets on my nerves finally. I don't like dead men. Now, the last 2 who fall sick is old man Mannard and my pal, young Pete Defoe. Pete has a $10 gold piece, and Mannard owns a dog. Inasmuch as they both knew that they can't weather it out till the break-up, Pete bets his $10 against the dog that he'll die before Maynard. Well, this is something new in the sporting line, and we began to string our bets pretty free. There ain't much excitement going on, so the boys visit the cabin every day, look over the entries, then go outside and make book. I open up a Paris Mutual. The old man is a 7-to-1 favorite at the start because he had all the best of it on form, but the youngster puts up a grand race. For 3 weeks they seesaw back and forth. First one looks like a winner, then the other. It's as pretty running as I ever see. Then Pete lets out a wonderful burst of speed, zings over the last quarter, noses out Maynard at the wire, and brings home the money. He dies at 3 a.m. and wins by 4 hours. I cop $84, 6 pairs of suspenders, a keg of wire nails, and a frying pan, which constitutes all the circulating medium of the camp. I'm the stakeholder for the late deceased also, so I find myself the administrator of Maynard's dog and the $10 that Pete put up. Now, seeing that it had been a killing finish, we arrange for a double-barreled burial and a swell funeral. The ground is froze, of course, but we dig 2 holes through the gravel till we break a pick point and decide to let it go at that. The bareheaded kid is clergyman because he has a square-cut coat that buttons up the front to his chin. There ain't any Bibles in camp, so he read some recipes out of a baking powder cookbook, after which Deaf Mike tries to play taps on the cornet. But he's held the horn in his mitt during the services, and the temperature being 40 degrees below freezo, when he wets his lips to play they stick to the mouthpiece, and crab the hymn. As a whole, it is an enjoyable affair, however, and the best conducted funeral of the winter. Everybody has a good time, though nothing rough. Now, I've been friendly to young Pete Defoe. Him and I bunked together, and the next night he comes to me, saying that he can't rest. I see him as plain as I see you. "What's wrong?" says I. "Are you cold?" "No, the ground is chilly, but it ain't that. Maynard, the old hellion, won't let me sleep. He's doing a sand jig on my grave. He says I won that bet crooked, and died ahead of time just to get his dog. He's sore on you, too." "What's he sore on me for?" says I. "He says he's an old man, and he'd 'a' died first if you hadn't put in with me to double-cross him. He's laying for you," says Pete. Well, I'm pretty sick myself with a 4 months' diet of pea soup and oatmeal, and when I wake up I think it's a dream. But the next night Pete is back again, complaining worse than ever. It seems the ghost of old man Maynard is still buck and winging on Pete's coffin, and he begs me to come down and call the old reprobate off, so that he can get some rest. He comes back the third night, the fourth, and the fifth, and by Maynard himself comes up to the cabin and begins to abuse me. He says he wants his dog back, but naturally I can't give it to him. It gets so that I can't sleep at all. Finally, when Pete ain't sitting on my bunk, Maynard is, calling me names and gritting his teeth at me. I begin to fall off in weight like a jockey in a sweat bath. It gets so I have to sit up all night in a chair and make the fellers prod me in the stomach with a stick whenever I doze off. I tell you, stranger, it was worse than horrible. I don't know how I made it through till spring. Well, in the early summer I get a letter from the steamboat agent at Nome saying Maynard's people out in the States have slipped him some coin, with instructions to send the old man out so they can give him decent burial. He offers me $150 to bring him down to the coast. Now, this decent burial talk makes me sore, for I staged the obsequies myself, and they were in perfect form. It was one of the tastiest funerals I ever mixed with. However, I'm broke, so I agree to deliver what is left of Maynard at the mouth of the river, and the agent says he'll have a first-class coffin shipped down to the trader at Chinook, our landing. When I deliver Maynard, ready for shipment, I get my $150. I give you my word I ain't tickled pink with this undertaking. I'm not strong on body snatching, and I have a hunch that the shade of old Maynard is still hanging around somewhere. However, a bird in the hand is the noblest work of God, and I need that roll, so I make ready. It takes me half a day to get drunk enough to want to do the job, and when I get drunk enough to want to do it, I'm so drunk I can't. Then I have to sober up and begin all over again. The minute I get sober enough to do the trick, I realize I ain't drunk enough to stand the strain. I jockey that way for quite a spell, till I finally strike an average, being considerable scared and reckless to the same extent. I remembered that we planted the old man in the left-hand grave, but when I get to the graveyard I can't recollect whether I stood at the foot or at the head of the hole during the services. A pint of that mining camp hooch would box the compass for any man, so I think I'll make sure. I have brought along 3 tools, a pick, a shovel, and a bottle of rye. The ground is froze, so I use all of 'em. Naturally, I can't afford to get the wrong Frenchman, so I pry up the lid of the first box I uncover and take a good rubber. Well, sir, it is a shock. Instead of rags and bones like I'm expecting, there is old Maynard in statuary quo, so to speak. Froze. Maybe so. Anyhow, he grins at me. That's what I said. He grins at me, and I take it on the lam. Understand, I have no intentions of running away. In fact, I don't know I'm doing it until I fetch up back in the saloon. It seems I just balanced my body on my legs, and they did all the work. Well, I'm pretty well rattled, so I blot up another pint of painkiller, and finally the bartender goes back with me and helps load Maynard into my Peterborough. I'm pretty wet by this time. We get the box into the canoe all right, but it's too big to fit under the seat, so we place the foot of it on the bottom of the boat and rest the other end on a paddle laid across the gunwales. This sort of gives Maynard the appearance of lounging back on an incline. You see, when I ripped up the boards to take a look, I broke off a piece at a knot-hole, and that allows him a chance to look out with one eye. He seems to approve of the position, however, so I get in at the stern facing him and ask if he's ready. He gives me the nod, and I shove off. Just for company, I take my grave-digging tools along, that is, all but the pick and the shovel. It was pretty near full when I started, but I lose the cork and drink it up for safety. I don't remember much about the first part of the trip, except that I get awful lonesome. By and by I began to sing. "Oh, the Frenchmen are in the bay," said the Shaun Van Vocht. "The French are in the bay," said the Shaun Van Vocht. "The French are in the bay, they'll be here without delay, but the colours will decay," said the Shaun Van Vocht. I've got a mean singing voice when I'm sober, but when I'm kippered it's positively insulting. It makes my passenger sore, and he shows it. Now, I'm not saying that Maynard wasn't as dead as a dried herring. He was past and gone, and he'd made his exit all right. He'd moved out, and his lease had expired. But I saw that box move. It shifted from side to side. I quit singing. My song fountain ran dry. Says I to myself, "I just neglected to lash you down, Mr. Maynard. You didn't really turn over. It was the motion of the boat." Then, just to make sure, I break forth into Johnny Crapaud, keeping my eye on the right lens of the old man where it showed through the broken board. This time there ain't a doubt of it. He lurches, box and all, clean out of plumb and nearly capsizes me. His one lamp blazes. Yes, sir, blazes. I tries to get out of range of it, but it follers me like a searchlight. I creeps forward to cover it up with my coat, but the old frog-eater leans to starboard so far that I have to balance on the port gunwale to keep from going over. We begin to spin in the current. Maynard sees he has me buffaloed, and it pleases him. He wags his head at me and grins like he did when he came to me in my sleep. Well, sir, that eye enthralls me. It destroys my chain of thought. I feel the chills stealing into my marrow, and that $150 looks mighty small and insignificant. By and by I begin to figure it out this way. Says I, "I've outrun him once to-day, and if I can get ashore I'll try it again." But when I turn the canoe toward shore, Maynard heels over till we take water. "Lie still, you blame fool," says I. "If you feel that way about it, I'll stay with the ship, of course." I can see the corner of his mouth curl up at that, and he slides back into position. Then I know that he'll let me stick as long as I don't try to pull out and leave him flat. You really can't blame a corpse much under the circumstances. However, I can't swim, so I try to square myself. I make conversation of a polite and friendly nature, and the old boy settles back to enjoy himself. Well, this one-sided talk-fest gets tiresome after a while. I run out of topics, so I tell him funny stories. Sometimes he likes them, and sometimes he most jumps out of the box. Sore? Say, when I pull a wheeze that he don't like, he makes it known quick, and I sit clutching the gunwales, with my hair on end, while he rocks the boat like a demon. When I get to the mouth of the river, it's night. I find a stiff breeze blowing, and the bay covered with whitecaps, so I try to convince Maynard that we'd better camp. But I no more than suggest it till I have to bail for dear life. Seeing that he's dead set to keep going, I kiss myself good-bye and paddle out across the bay. How we ever made it I don't know, but along about midnight we blow into Chinook, with me singing songs to my passenger and cracking Joe Millers that came over in '76. I'm still pretty drunk. The trader tells me that the coffin hasn't come from Nome yet, but the steamer is due before morning, so I ask him to cache Maynard somewhere and wake me up when the boat comes. Then I go to the hay. I'm tuckered out. It seems that the coaster comes in a few hours later, but the trader is dealing a stud game and tells the purser to dump his freight on the beach. They do as ordered, then pull out. About daylight the wind shifts, the tide rises and begins to wash the merchandise away. Two roughnecks get busy saving their outfit, when what comes bobbing past on the waves but a handsome zinc-lined casket, the one from Nome. "Hey, Bill, cop that box. It'll make a swell bathtub," says one. So the other pulls up his rubber boots, wades out, and brings it in. The trader, hearing that his goods are in danger, adjourns the game long enough to see about it. He hurries down to the beach, looks over his stuff, then inquires, "Where's my coffin?" "You ain't got no more coffin than a rabbit," says one of the miners. "Oh, yes, I have. That's it right there." "I guess not. That's my coffin. I copped it on the high seas. Flotsam and jetsam," says the roughneck. "What's more, I'm going to use it for a cupboard or a cozy corner. If you want it bad, pay me $50 salvage and it's yours." Naturally, the trader belched. "All right. If you don't want it, I'll use it myself," says the miner. "It's the first one I ever had, and I like it fine. There's no tellin' when I'll get another." "Said time ain't but a minute," observes the trader, "unless you gimme that freight." There is some further dispute, till the miner, being a quick-tempered party, reaches for his gat. After the smoke clears away, it is found that he has made an error of judgment, that the storekeeper is gifted as a prophet, and that the roughneck is ready for his coffin. Now, inasmuch as this had been a purely personal affair, and the boys was anxious to reopen the stud game, they exonerated the trader from all blame complete, and he, being ever anxious to maintain a reputation for fair dealing, and just to show that there ain't no animus behind his action, gives the coffin to the man who had claimed it. What's more, he helps me to lay him out with his own hands. Naturally, this is considered conduct handsome enough for any country. In an hour the man is buried, and the poker game is open again. The trader apologizes to the boys for the delay, saying, "The box is mine all right, and I'm sorry this play come up, but the late lamented was so set on having that piece of bric-a-brac that it seemed a shame not to give it to him." At this point the narrator fell silent, much to my surprise, for throughout this weird recital I had sat spellbound, forgetful of the hour, the storm outside, and the snoring men in the bunk-room. When he had gone thus far, he began with a bewildering change of topic. "Did you ever hear how Dawson Sam cut the ears off a bank dealer?" "Hold on," said I. "What's the rest of this story? What become of Maynard?" "Oh, he's there yet, for all I know," said the stranger as he shuffled the cards. "His folks wouldn't send no more money, the steamboat agent at Nome had done his share, and the trader at Chinik said he wasn't responsible." "And you? Didn't you get your $150? "No, you see it was C.O.D. shipment. I wake up along about noon, put my head under the pump, and then look up the trader. He is still playing stud. "'Where's my casket?' says I. 'I've got my dead man, but I don't collect on him till he's crated, and F.O.B.' The trader has an ace in the hole and 2 kings in sight, so he says over his shoulder, 'I'm sorry, old man, but while you was asleep a tenderfoot jumped your coffin. Now, this Dawson Sam has a crooked bank dealer named—' I think I'll go back to bed," said I. End of Story 6.